We are joined today by one of the great scholars of the Grimoire Tradition, David Rankin, author of dozens of texts on the subject of magic, most notably his work published through Golden Horde with Dr. Stephen Skinner. His work has been hugely influential in forming an entire generation of practitioners, expanding our knowledge and casting light onto the practices of magicians of centuries past. David has always been a personal hero of mine, not only because of his commitment to the task of revealing these hidden treasures, but because he is such a genuinely great guy, always willing to share his knowledge. His passion for his work is undeniable. I am your host, Matt Hadfield, and I am very happy to have David Rankin here on the Hadean Press podcast. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Matt. Thanks very much.
I'm sure everyone already knows who you are, but maybe our audience haven't heard your personal story. So could you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in the subject of the grimoires and magic in general?
So as a child, I was a sort of precocious reader and loved to read from a very young age. So when I was about 6, 7, I discovered like world mythologies and read things like sort of the Greek and Norse and Celtic and Egyptian myths. I was very lucky. The school I went to offered extra maths and English lessons for people who, showed ability in those areas. So I got extra lessons and got taught to speed read when I was 7, which is a skill that's been immensely valuable through my life. When I was 10, I discovered the Tao Te Ching, which remains my favorite book ever. Also worked my way through Carl Jung's collected works, which was very heavy going, but interesting in places. Some of his ideas appealed, others did not. And at 14, had like an incident at school where somebody tried to stab me, which did not go down very well. And afterwards, this guy and I both got sent to see like a counsellor. And the counsellor said, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with you. You've just got a lot of energy. You need to find something constructive to do with it." I came out of this meeting and a friend of mine said, "Oh, I thought you might be interested in this," and handed me a catalogue from Occultique, who was an occult supplier that supplied magic books and paraphernalia and things back then. And so we're talking like late 70s. And I looked at it, and I looked through it was the book catalogue, and I'm going to get some of these books. And I ordered 6 books. I think the spirit influence is definitely coming in here. My first 6 books that I ordered on magic were The Key of Solomon, The Grimoire of Armadale, The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, Crowley's Magic, Levi's Transcendental Magic, and Techniques of High Magic by Francis King and Stephen Skinner.
Right.
Why I chose those 6, I don't know. Those were the ones that, so I ordered them, they came. Read Techniques of High Magic first. But this is what I'm going to do with my life. Started doing the stuff out of it. From then on, it was like 2 hours a day, every day, meditation, practicing things like the pentagram ritual, hexagram, which are the rose cross, middle pillar, doing visualizations, building up a big library of books and reading them. Went back after reading that and looked at things like the Key of Solomon, started ordering other books, looking in the bibliographies of the books, seeing what appealed, and by and large getting a lot of good books back then, like 79, 80, 81, that sort of period. Books weren't so easy to get, but the percentage of good books to dross and fluff was much higher. So there were a lot more figuratively good books that you could get. And had a better chance, if you didn't know, getting a book that had good content rather than being like 101 again. So at 16, I decided that I was going to do one of these conjuration things. Did my first conjuration, made my first pact. Looking back now, I wince and shudder at my sort of naivety and how fortunate I was that it didn't go horribly wrong. But it went very well. And things kind of carried on from there. At 18, I was in the right place at the right time and somebody at a sports club I was at asked me a question and I get answered, and he said, "Oh, that was the right answer." He'd noticed I used to wear a little silver tree of life around my neck, and he was in this magical lodge, very old school, private lodge. Said, "If you're interested, I can introduce you to the master of the temple." I was like, "Hell yeah!" I went and met this guy, and he said, "Right, you'll come back this time next week, and I'm going to test you on various things. If you make any mistakes, I'm not interested in you."
Oh, wow.
You get
Okay.
right, you get in. Fortunately, it was all stuff I'd been memorizing for years, like attributions and Kabbalah and things like that. I got in. It was derived from Stella Matutina, but they basically did grimoire stuff. And the guy who was the master of the temple had an eidetic memory. So he only had to look at things once and have the conjurations in his head and could just, very lucky. But that was fabulous. I mean, it really set me up. I mean, in a way, you could say it kind of spoiled me because it had really high expectations when I started meeting people on the scene, that other people would adhere to those sort of standards of dedication and practice and behavior.
Was it
And
then that you felt that you were going to write about these things as well?
at that point, it was just practice.
Right.
Writing came later. I mean, I did love writing. I'd written lots of short stories and things when I was younger, but at that point, I wasn't thinking about writing. I think back in those days, people didn't tend to write until they've been practicing for like decades. It wasn't, oh, I've like watched a few videos on YouTube, been to a workshop and read a couple of books. Now I can write a book on it. No, it was people who had put in the slog and done the work for years and years. Those are the people who tended to write the books. So yeah, that was a fabulous experience. And from there, I moved, and you had to live locally to be in the lodge. So I left on good terms, but I couldn't carry on in it because it would have been traveling to it, and you had to live within a certain radius of where the temple was to be in it. And then sort of, over the years, met other people, got involved with other traditions, carried on doing sort of like the grimoire stuff as a solo thing after that. But I didn't really think about writing about the grimoires, I think, really until I met Stephen Skinner.
Well, that brings us to our next question, which was some of my all-time favorite texts on magic are from Golden Horde, because they cover such a wide spectrum of what I think has been available to the grimoire magicians over the past few centuries. And you really do such an amazing job of focusing on what's important about each individual document and what each individual document brings to the table in regard to the entire practice. But could you tell us a little bit about how Golden Horde got started?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I'd written a few books, not on grimoires, on other magical areas. And a mutual friend, I was at a mutual friend's house, and I was introduced to Stephen, and we were introduced and we just clicked. Sometimes you just meet someone, there's like an instant rapport. And we just sort of said hello to each other, and he was just like, "I've got this manuscript I'd like to show you. Do you want to have a look?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Like a paper copy of one of the manuscripts which went into the first Golden Horde book of the D Enochian stuff. And he says, "I was thinking about working on this. How about we work on it together?" I was like, "Yeah." So, should we like make a publishing company and do lots of stuff together? And it's like, that sounds good. So in 5 minutes of meeting, we'd decided to like work together and form Golden Horde. And at the time, Stephen was living out in the Far East, so he, every now and again would come back to London. But it was like a sort of long distance, the advantage of the internet, writing relationship where I was the one who was going generally to places like the British Library and the Wellcome and other places, and sifting through the catalogues and getting the manuscripts out and ordering us copies, electronic copies where they're available, where not. In some instances, having to pay to have them photographed and things, because there's a lot more availability now, 20 years later. But you go back to things like the manuscripts in the veritable Key of Solomon, for example, cost us £3,000 to have photographed.
Mm.
And when people do this thing of like saying, "Oh, what it should be free, we can PDF it, we can steal people's material. That's an example of the things that they don't take into account. You know, the hours, the hundreds of hours of research time, you know, sitting there in the welcome with 20 manuscripts of the Key of Solomon, with a laptop open and an Excel spreadsheet, going through them systematically, recording what's on every single one, where, you know, what the things are, doing all of the research grunt work and things that goes in to trying to make the best book you can. Obviously, when Stephen was over, we'd go to the libraries together and to the Bodleian and other places, and then we would like take parts each to work on, pass them, you know, between each other, make suggestions, and end up with a finished product. And it's really funny because he and I have a very similar writing style. I think it'd be very hard for someone to look at those books and say, I can tell that Stephen wrote that chapter or that David wrote that chapter.
I can't tell at all, and I've actually gone through them and tried to. Yeah, you both write in such an amazing way. I always imagined that it was, for instance, that you would approach a chapter or a section, and then Stephen Skinner would maybe revise it and then send it back to you, and so it was like a process that you were both creating.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We would send each other the chapters for revisions and suggestions, send it back. Then, if though that might then inspire something else to be added, to send it back again, and sort of go. Sometimes it bounced back 3 or 4 times before, you know, we were happy with like the final version of a chapter, or something else came up that we discovered and said, oh god, that's got to go in now as well. That's the other thing, you know, you go down so many rabbit holes when you're doing grimoire research. You know, you go, okay, there's this, oh my god, that leads over there, which leads to there, to there, to there. Suddenly you're somewhere completely different,
and you have to make it
looking back at
in a chapter.
The little thing that's like somewhere in the distance. But you end up with like, oh my god, this is amazing. Oh, I'm gonna have to do another book on this because this stuff needs to be added too. But it's not, you know, it's like Clavis Inferni. That's a good example. You know, I found that very early on, in sort of right at the beginning of when Golden Horde was formed. I was in the welcome and I pulled it up. In those days, there were still like cards with them on, so you could see when it was last seen. Nobody had looked at that manuscript for over 50 years.
Oh wow.
So I pulled it up and I was like, oh my god, this is beautiful. It's such a lovely text.
It's one of my favorite. Yeah.
And I looked and it's like, Jesus, it's also such a bloody pain in the ass cipher text. You know, it's full of all of these different magical languages and contractions, and then contracted and reversed. And that was going to be book 2, which is why one of the images from Clavis is on the front of book 2. But it took us a good couple of years of going through and working on it and deciphering it. And, you know, a couple of instances, a couple of odd bits we couldn't get that friends were able to help with. Like there was one bit, friend Professor Peter Forshaw, who teaches Amsterdam, doing the you know, esoteric MA over there. He was one. There was one of the alphabet characters we couldn't get, and I asked Joe Peterson, and he was very kindly able to help with it. You know, there's that fraternity and sense of support, I think, in the grimoire tradition that you don't see to the same extent in a lot of other magical traditions in the West. You know, much more of a, you're doing this, great, people support, people will help. There's not the same bitchiness of things. People just want there to be good material out there. And Clavis, it's really funny because it's the Cyprian thing, and at that point there was very little English material on Cyprian out. And when Clavis came out, after that, suddenly there was more Cyprian stuff. So I'm not saying it caused there to be more Cyprian stuff in English, because obviously there's this huge amount of Iberian stuff and South America with Cyprian, but it might have like triggered more people to go, oh, hang on, we need to be looking, finding more and putting more stuff out in English about Cyprian, because he's such an important figure. So yeah, I mean, after a while, with Stephen being out there and me being there and also having like other things going on, we decided to sort of like part ways, and Stephen carried on with Golden Horde. And I worked on like other writing projects. Although a few years back we were talking, and I mentioned I just started re-looking at one of the manuscripts we had back then, because we had a big collection of manuscripts that were taken, you know, got copies of. And he said, oh yeah, I am as well. And I said, oh, I'm looking at such and such, and I've started transcribing it. And he's going, I'm looking at the same one, and I've started transcribing it.
Oh no! So you
Yes, we
moved the
should.
information again.
Yes, we should work on this one then. So, and that was like, the Cunning Man's Grimoire. So we're
Wonderful.
both on the other side of the world from each other, and both at the same time decided to start working on it. And it's an example, I think, of that sort of rapport between us. And as a result, that one, was like us collaborating again, which was really nice.
Well, yeah, I'm always looking forward to more material from you and Dr. Skinner because honestly, I think some of the texts that you've published through Golden Horde are some of the most important texts on the entire grimoire tradition.
I would say you have to add Joe Peterson in there as well. Joe's stuff is hugely important. He's an amazing scholar. All the books he's put out have been fantastic additions, which have also helped expand the field so much. So it was really Joe, Stephen, and myself back in the early noughties who I think really between us got things going with him doing his amazing work and the Esoteric Archives website, which is a fabulous resource, and Steve and I were Golden Horde. So yeah, I think Joe is, I would call it, it's almost like the modern patron saint of the grimoires for all he has contributed. He is just amazing.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed entirely. And for the listeners, if you haven't already checked out Joseph Peterson's website, then the information for it will be in the show notes at the end. Right. Next question then, David. Regarding the grimoires in general, the majority of magical orders in the 19th and the 20th centuries would have happily whitewashed the grimoires away into complete obscurity. Why do you think that these maligned texts were so dismissed?
I think there's a combination of factors. I mean, if you look at the late Victorian era and the Golden Dawn, and moving on from there, there's this intrigue of the East and Eastern things coming in. Stuff with Tantra, yoga, things like the Tattvas. So there's like the elements of that creeping in. There's sort of a passion for neat structure. There was also the Egyptology revival going on, and so these things have this exoticness about them, which appealed to people. There's always that intrigue of the exotic, whereas the grimoires was like kind of like the European stuff from the past, which, depending on what you looked at, could be construed as being not very positive. I mean, if Mavers, bless him, three of my six first books were, Mavers books. But in all of them, like his Key of Solomon, he cut and pasted from, 7 different manuscripts, bits and pieces, put it together. That's being still considered the definitive edition in academia, which is hilarious when you look at the Veritable Key, which is 3 complete manuscripts, which represent 3 different families of texts, and also Joe Peterson's Key of Solomon and things. Those are far more definitive and scholarly than Mavers ever was. His Grimoire of Armadale is a mess. His Abramelin is from one of the French manuscripts, which is only partial and with a 6-month rather than the 18-month full one of the German text. And that's the funny thing. The Abramelin, I always thought, oh, there's the French, there's the German. When I was doing the research for the book, no, there's about 15 different manuscripts of the Abramelin. There's lots of them, including a load in Italy. So I think there was an interest, but it was like this sort of the distance thing. And of course, the Goetia, it got its infamy through Crowley, with Goetia and the famous Alan Bennett. You've been playing with the Goetia, then the Goetia's been playing with you.
Oh, yeah. Is it Liber 231, one of Crowley's received grimoires on the tarot, which he said you should never leave it open with the sigils showing, right? In the same way that maybe they will subtly influence people around them. What do you think about that? Do you think that there's something to that?
Well, I think that's that sort of principle of like, if you make a seal, they would normally be kept concealed and then revealed for the operation. And that, a seal is usually acting as a gateway for the influence of that spirit. So leaving it uncovered, if it's been consecrated and charged, then arguably an influence could permeate from it. But I think the mindset was very different back then. to magic and the world in general. We've had the age of technology come upon us in recent decades, which was not present there. They didn't have access to stuff in the same way. If you look at the Golden Dawn syllabus, it's kind of like, it sort of feels like Mathers was just playing stay ahead, trying to keep a couple of lessons ahead of the people down there to make sure they had material to work with. Oh, I'll throw some Enochian in now, and it's kind of like the chaos magic of its day. It was like this eclectic mix in the Golden Dawn.
Yeah.
If you look at the Enochian and Egyptian, and you've got a bit of Indian stuff with things like the Tattvas, and then there's sort of Kabbalah and a bit of alchemy, and it really is quite a mishmash.
And they would be the first people to get upset about chaos magic as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
it's
they
interesting.
really were the ones in that who were doing that. Like, let's try and put stuff together and see what works.
Yeah, putting it, there's like synthesis. Yeah. Creating a syncretic system. Yeah. And then you look back all the way back to the PGM, and even they were doing the same. Perhaps many people in our audience think that the grimoires are specifically a late medieval European tradition. But it's safe to say now that we are dealing with a series of transmissions of practice which span thousands of years and multiple cultures and continents. Could you tell us a little history about how this tradition began, and what, if anything, you have discovered by writing your encyclopedia?
The first thing that became clear, or I suppose already clear, but became far more evident, was that there's like three big threads running there of from Greco-Egyptian, Jewish, and Arabic magic, all in there, set in a essentially Christian cosmology. You could say Abrahamic, because there are some texts that, like if you take in the Jewish and Arabic influence, but the majority being Christian. And as you say, it is a transmission of this material, of the practices. We look at them, and it's not, they don't just stop at the PG. I mean, I use the Testament of Solomon, I suppose, and as the first good example of a spirit list, and the PGM for all of the stuff in there, which we see repeated through the grimoires, as kind of starting points. But those are already, kind of at the tail end of stuff in some respects, from things that went before them. So I think really, and this is an ongoing thing, we need to look back to Egypt and Sumer and look at some of the practices there and see, well, the techniques have carried on. And not, we don't claim it's an unbroken tradition, but you can see, in a sense, unbroken use of technique and practice and ideas which come to like a new coherence in the grimoires from about the 12th century onwards.
So talking about exploring further back than Egypt, back to Sumer and Mesopotamia, could you say anything about the potential astrological origins of the current grimoire spirits? Is there any kind of potential transmission, a direct transmission?
Well, it's interesting when we go back and look into those early civilizations that were so heavily focused on the stars and astrology. One of the first things you notice is like you have like deities and spirits of the decans, the 36 divisions of 10 degrees each of the zodiac, which we subsequently see with decan spirits in the grimoires. We also have like spirits attributed to hours of the day and night, which is a big thing in the grimoires. So the ideas of time and space from those first civilizations permeate the later practices of the grimoires. You have the zodiacal, planetary, as well as the decans, throughout. The spirit, all sorts of spirits and deities associated with them. And you see that in the grimoires. I mean, what is noticeable with the majority of grimoires, whilst there are exceptions, is the majority don't really have a lot of elemental stuff in comparison to the level of astrological stuff. There's far more, spirits of different types associated, like say, with the planets, with zodiacal signs, with the decans, with the mansions of the moon, than there are with your four elements. And the mansions of the moon is a good example of that transmission of ideas. Initially, people tend to go, "Oh yeah, mansions of the moon comes from the Picatrix. It's an Arabic thing." You go, "Well, actually, no, it's not. Where do the Arabs get it from?" You look and you find it's like from early Greek philosophers, and then you look and you find the Greeks took it from the Indians, and
yeah.
so mansions of the moon actually comes from India, and so that's another thing that needs to be looked at is how much of an Indian influence is has crept into grimoires that we're not aware of, because clearly you've got the mansions of the moon. There's the idea of the almandal, again coming from the mandala, the almandal, again Arabic coming through from India. So there's definitely aspects there. What I think the Grimoire Encyclopaedia has done is kind of signposted some of these other bits. It's like you've taken a jigsaw and put it together, only to find that jigsaw you've created is like one piece in a bigger jigsaw. And there's all the other areas to go off to, and that need to be far more needs to be done, looking back more at the influence from India, from Egypt and Sumer, as well as continuing to explore, like the Greek. The PGM is huge, but there's lots of other material from that period around it that's also very relevant. And Jake Grant, the prime example of somebody who was like delving around and exploring that stuff and bringing things together and going, look, there's this whole thing here we need to be looking at and recognizing that the goers, the sorcerers, were doing this stuff which we can then see transmitting through into the grimoires. We need more people like Jake, rest in power, who are doing that kind of stuff, who are like practitioners with that scholarly bent, who have that inquisitive mind and want to like put it out there to develop the tradition for everybody.
So do you think that the elemental aspects sort of they move into the transmission of the tradition in Greece with, say, Empedocles? Is that where we start to see more of an elemental aspect of these spirits taking priority over astrological?
I think there is that presence there in Greece, but I don't think in the grimoires per se that the elemental stuff gets that big till Paracelsus. Because you look at the grimoires before, and there's not that much. And looking at the material, not surprisingly with it being Paracelsus, the first place I think we really start to see the elemental stuff permeating through significantly is Germany, and then kind of spreading out more from there into other texts. But there has been this tendency, and this is something which I think hopefully we're largely past now, of this Anglo-centric view of the grimoires, that in the past there was very much this sort of for English speakers, the way stuff was being portrayed, and now there's all these everyone's realized, hang on, the grimoire tradition was focused not just in England, it's in France and Germany and Italy, and there's all these other bits elsewhere as well, and there's the Arabic stuff coming through, and there's all the Jewish stuff, and
we have to be really careful and quite creative as well, because the best umbrella term we have really is Western, but Western incorporates everything from Iceland to Egypt, and everything in between. So what then is the definition of a grimoire? Are there any specific components which define a text on magic as such?
Well, for me, when you look at all, like in the Grimoire Encyclopaedia, I did like 100 subchapters on text, individual texts. Of those, about 90 grimoires, and the other 10 are important books for the tradition. Things like the PGM, Testament of Solomon, the Bible, Antipolus Maleficorum of Trithemius, Liber de Spirites, which is spiritless, but they're also important. And looking across all of those grimoires, it's clear there are like actually three main themes that we see running through. One of them is spirit conjuration, one of them is divination, and I found something like 36 different types of divination spread through the grimoires. And one of them is the simple charm stroke spell work for dealing with day-to-day stuff rather than things that require a whole big conjuration process. And so in different proportions, those three tend to be present in pretty much all of the grimoires. As I said earlier, they're generally set within a Christian stroke Abrahamic cosmology with a set idea of like that there being hierarchies of spirits. There's usually the magic circle, paraphernalia, consecrations. So there's a whole load of criteria which, for me, trying to put things into grimoire, I personally don't hold with the modern view of just calling a book a grimoire because it sounds good and it will sell books. So most of the books I see these days, modern books where people say this is the grimoire of so-and-so, it's like, no, it's not. You're just putting that on the title to make sales. But for me, that does not fit into what the grimoire tradition is about. Maybe I'm being snobby there, but that's how I feel about it.
No, I think it's good. You've been able to, more so than many other people, really go through all of these manuscripts and work out what things connect them and what makes them definitively a grimoire compared to another text. So I think those of us that have pre-ordered a copy of your book are extremely excited to get our hands on it. We all have our own interests and focuses in our research and practice, but in your own words, what do you think your encyclopedia provides for the student?
Okay, so there's the 2 volumes which they're part of a greater whole, but they're also quite distinct in their way. So volume 1 is the 100, like I say, sub-chapters, and for each of those there's information. So the earliest known date we have for it, the different manuscripts we know exist for it, influences from other grimoires, the spirit list for that, whether it has a magic circle, what tools are used. That's like a thing that's at the top for each one. And then a basic précis of what's in the grimoire. And then an essential reading list of all the books. So I'm interested in this grimoire, so I really think, okay, what books should I also read to further my understanding if I want to practice with it? And one of the reasons I wanted to do this, because there's been so much great work done in the last 20 years. It's quite overwhelming to people coming in. Like the volume of material that is there is huge. And like I say, there is so much good stuff. I mean, aside from, you already mentioned, like Joe Peterson, Steve, myself, there's all the other people like, Dan Harms, Phil Lagarde, Frater Atcher, Al Cummings. There's so many people doing good work. Lots of other people, I apologize, I haven't mentioned, but they are mentioned in that essential reading. Like, these people's work is there with like little comments about what it contains in those books and why you should get them, basically. And also the academics who have been doing work, people like Claire Fanger, Robert Matheson, Richard Kirchhofer, also been putting out great books, very dry academic books, but they often have the text and material in there that we can make use of. So it's to highlight all of this work, as well as work by people who are not writing in English. There's reference to books in French and Italian and other things in there that it might not be people's first language, but if people do speak it, it's a good signpost to go off for other books on the subjects. So really, the 100 chapters was designed to give people an introduction to all of those different grimoires, some of which, when I started, I didn't even know existed. There's so many. There's also the spirit list of every spirit from every grimoire and where it turns up.
I am very excited for that. Yes.
Which runs to, I think, there's something like about 12,500 spirits in that list.
Oh, wow.
A chapter I did, this sort of introductory chapters about the development of the grimoires, and one on practice, where I kind of give a template for the whole process of preparation, practice, etc., for a conjuration, which I do stress is my suggestions. It's not saying it's the best way or the only way, but things that I think are useful for people to be aware of, and things that I found useful to add in. Because with grimoires, the grimoires were often written by someone who didn't expect other people to read them. So they're not written as a manual of having everything you need to know. Often there's bits missing because the person would know that stuff and not feel they need to write it down, for example, or it was in another grimoire they had. So, my principle with the grimoire practice and conjuration is you don't take stuff out, but you can sometimes improve it by adding things in. And so there's suggestions of things that can be added in beneficially to improve the chances of success in conjuration. And then the second part is the majority of the appendixes. So there's, like every plant and its use that's mentioned in all the grimoires, every incense ingredient, every incense and oil recipe, every use of different metals, every use of different crystals, all the magical tools, all the magic circles, all the different forms of divination, all the materia magica. That's a fascinating one. There's pages of like this blood and brains and bones and things.
Wonderful.
Pages and pages. You want to know what bat blood's used for? There's like half a dozen different uses through the grimoires. Here. That for me was one of the most exciting things, because as I was putting that together, you can suddenly see transmission through the materia magica. Like, hang on, this has got a charm which has used all the same ingredients, and then it turns up 2 centuries later, and you didn't think that this was influenced by it, but it's the same charm. Which if I hadn't had that thing of the materia magica, I might not have spotted. It's there's the entry next to it. Oh, same thing. There's 2, and the same thing. For example, I think it was in, I think it's the Grand Albert, either the big or the little Albert. One of the charms was one that came straight from the Picatrix. And there's no, you wouldn't have thought there's transmission from Picatrix into there, but boom, when you look at the materia magica and the charm, yes, it did. So it gives a whole different way of, looking at the material. There's a few others. I listed all the different spirit feasts. There's one on timings and days of the month, out the hours and days. There's a lot of appendixes and stuff. I mean, sitting there with 8 or 10 files open as I went through them line by line, making the notes, cutting it in. That's what a large chunk of those 3 years' work was, just going through and fastidiously recording all the information so it was there in this nice A to Z, easy to use form. And also, of course, if you look at the bibliography, there's the manuscript bibliography. So every manuscript and where they're located is also included. The manuscript bibliography is probably about 1,000 manuscripts. So you're interested in this particular thing, like I mentioned, the Abermelin. Well, actually, there's about 15 different Abermelin manuscripts, and they're located in this university library, and this one, and this one. And so I really wanted it to be a resource for people who are scholars and practitioners, that it signposts people to where to go if they want to practice more, also where to go to find out more, and the avenues to they can pursue to go off down their own rabbit holes. And it was like the book I had to write. I was kind of pushed to write. For me, I feel this is my magnum opus. This is over 40 years on since I started practicing, and this is like my devotion to the tradition and to the spirits of the tradition.
It's wonderful. It's going to change the landscape of how people study this subject entirely. Very excited for it. So bringing up part 2, which I'm particularly interested in, there are a lot of specific techniques that we find in the grimoires, which you probably won't find in modern books on magic. So do you think that there are specific techniques in the grimoires which could help improve people's approach to spirit conjuration, divination, and spells?
Yeah, I mean, from the point of view of conjuration, there's a lot of material in there which I think would be beneficial. And divination, there's a lot of different techniques of divination. The spirit feast is a classic example. That's, I think, something we see back there, which goes back again to at least ancient Egypt, where there's mention of a spirit feast, for example, with Anubis, and getting Anubis to provide a spirit feast for the gods and to get answers from them. And there's, I mean, quick aside here, one of the books that I put in as essential reading in the practice chapter is Jason Miller's Consorting with Spirits. And for me, that's one of the best books that's been written in the last 20 years on magic. I think that is an absolute must read for anyone doing spirit work. And, he is really elegantly and lucidly, put across the whole gamut of material for people doing spirit work. So kind of like a lot of the stuff I haven't gone into because I didn't need to, because somebody else, Jason, has already done it so well that, there's no need to repeat it. And that's one of the points I'm kind of trying to also make with the Grimoire Encyclopaedia. There's a whole range of people out there doing great work, and I wanted to signpost their work so that people go and go, okay, so I'm interested in this. Oh, go and look at that book that Frater Atcher wrote, or go and look at that book by Dan Harms, because that's going to give you so much help following on that path.
Your encyclopedia is going to enable us to buy even more books.
Oh, absolutely.
Even more, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. I want to ask a little nerdy question. For me, really, when you've gone through all these spirits from the catalogs, have you found, for instance, what you think is perhaps the origin of, say, Eastern spirit, like Duke Cyrac or Skirlin, Tantan of Valerion, where they originate in the grimoire tradition? Or, for instance, say, the Sargo, like, who isn't in there but shows up later on in, say, like the Book of Offices and then the Ars Goetia. By using your book, will people be able to, for instance, fill in the dots and discover these things?
With those ones you mentioned, they all seem to just turn up in the 16th century, pretty much. There's like nothing earlier about them. I've given the earliest examples of everything I can with the manuscripts. I've traced everything back as far as I'm able and used the earliest sources every time that are accessible. So what that kind of points to is two things. One of them for me is there's still a lot of stuff to find out, and there's still a lot of stuff that hasn't surfaced yet that will further open up field of study even more. And the other is, this is a huge spirit catalogue. It's 12,500 spirits or so, but that's only a tiny fraction of the number of spirits out there. And yes, there's the spirits that are listed in the various different grimoires and that you can conjure, but there's an awful lot of other spirits out there as well beyond them. A good analogy would be, if I go to London or New York to visit, I'll have some friends there who I might meet up with, but there's a vast population of people there who I don't know. I might meet a few more of them, make contact with them, but the rest of them are still there. Just because I have nothing to do with them doesn't mean that they're not getting on and doing their own thing and living their own lives. And I think it's the same principle with the spirits. You look at all of these rulers who have thousands of spirits under them and things who aren't named, and it may well be that if you do a conjuration with spirit, that you get the name of one of the spirits working for them, to work with you. I've encountered spirits who aren't in any of the grimoires, who gave me like a public name to use for them and the secret name that I use when I actually work with them. And so, yeah, that's an example of how the grimoires kind of act as a focus, I think, for us. But we shouldn't think that what is written in the grimoires we have is the whole picture by any means. There's still more, I think there's still a lot of manuscripts that haven't surfaced yet, maybe even grimoires that haven't surfaced yet. I mean, when Summa Sacra Magicae hits in English, that's going to be the biggest thing. That's more important than Agrippa's 3 books.
Oh, do you have an inside story on that you're willing to tell us all about?
Well, there are people working on it. I mean, it's 800 pages.
Yeah, I know.
It's like things like Liber Juratus and various other texts turn up, and it's a working magician's book. It's insane. There's all sorts of interesting stuff. And one of the things I love about it, it proved something I suggested back in 2005, which was that there was an influence from the Macabre tradition into grimoires. And sure enough, that got proved by Summa Sacra Magicae. So I was quite chuffed about that.
Could you describe what that is? Is that a Jewish tradition?
The Macabre tradition is this Jewish tradition. It was mainly this sort of scribe stroke priestly class of. Macabre means chariot, and it's like you ride the macabre into the presence of God, going through the seven heavens. You have to have 7 pairs of seals to show to the angels guarding each of the gates, or they beat the crap out of you and kick you out. And the idea of it is this mystical journey to get into the presence of God. A story of like these 4 rabbis who do the macabre journey. One dies, one goes insane, one bottles out, and one makes it. So 25% success rate, one actually made it into the presence of God. And they were like full on, like, mega experienced rabbis. So the macabre tradition is fascinating Jewish mystical tradition that kind of goes into influence into Kabbalah as well. And there's one of the traces that came in Summa Sacra Magicae, and this is fascinating from its implications for me. There's 7 items of clothing the magician wears, like the robe and the shoes and the things, and they all have these divine names put on them, which are taken from one of the macabre texts, the Shir Coma, or Measure of the Body of God, was this heretical text that describes the vastness of the body of God and how big each bit is, and all the divine names on his body. So you are literally putting on the robe, the clothing, with the name of God on the different parts of your body that corresponds to that. So it's like you are assuming the body of God when you do the conjurations. And that blew my head when I thought, wow, that makes so much sense. You can see
this idea of 7 as well. I mean, it goes back to what we were saying before about Sumer and Mesopotamia. Like, for instance, didn't Inanna also have 7 items of clothing that she did essentially a catabasis, that she descended into the underworld, which I assume she also would have had a password, which would have been granted at the same time. And then the priests would, maybe, I don't know if there's enough evidence of that, if the priests would enact a similar ritual. But still, it's fascinating to see how myth informs practice.
Those 7 items are attributed to the 7 classical planets as well.
Yes,
in Summa Sacra Magicae.
But then we also see in Sacra Summa Magicae, the Brian Johnson's pamphlet, Naming the Heavens, also has, for instance, the 7 planets, their angels and spirits, demons, and the permutations of each of the planets in each of the signs of the zodiac. Again, highly recommended for everyone listening. If you
another person who's doing great work, Brian is.
Yes, definitely. Good. Final main question for you. Let's see. Do you think that the tradition of the grimoires has concluded, and that the only way to explore them is to continue reconstructing more from historical sources? Or would you say it's a tradition that could be reignited?
I think it has been reignited. In his last book, The School of Night book, Jake kindly described Stephen and I as having reignited the grimoire revolution. And I think that the tradition has been reignited, but not just by what we've been doing, what Joe Peterson and others have been doing with the grimoires. I think it's also been reignited by the rise in spirit work that's come in through from the ATRs and the rise in folk magic. I think those factors as well, because the folk magic and the spirit work kind of merge in the grimoires. And I think they have been also responsible from the ground level, as it were, for reigniting of the tradition and the sort of the way it's caught fire, and it really has, the last 20 years, like wildfire. And it's like, every few months, it seems there's like new developments and new exciting material coming out.
Do you think it's possible then for new grimoires to come into being? Of course, all grimoires have some basis on a previous grimoire. They're usually influenced by others, but do you think it's possible today for new hierarchies and new sets of spirits to be catalogued via the process of magic and then come into being?
I think it is. The challenge that is going to be faced by that is for it to be successful and not seen as just one person's UPG. If it's completely, ones that people have no familiarity with, and I've already stated that I think, the vast percentage of spirits are ones that people don't have familiarity with. So I think it's entirely possible for it to be done if it's following the principles of grimoire practice, and if people do, encounter spirits that can be successfully conjured by others, then yes, I see no reason why there can't be fresh grimoires coming out. Absolutely. I think it would be hubris on our part to assume that it couldn't. And that would be also a very stale perspective. The whole point of any living tradition is that it moves forward. And also, I think one of the things that personally will come more into grimoire practice is working with the dead. Any living tradition honors its dead. And there's elements of that in the grimoires, but I think that there are more and more people practicing grimoire magic who have other associations and affiliations as well. So there is a lot more of that work with ancestors and the spirits of the dead coming into grimoire practice.
Well, I could interview you again just on that subject and have another whole hour's worth of questions just on that, David, because that's something I'm particularly interested in. Yeah, that's wonderful. Right, well, I think we should wrap up now, but thank you so much for answering these questions. I suppose my last question is, what's next after this has taken you years, so I hope you're relaxing and enjoying your free time a little bit now while this before it finally releases to everybody. But do you have any projects that you're working on next?
Yeah, I do. I've got a list of books that I would plan on writing still. One of the next ones I work on will be, I'm going to do, at some point in the future, there will be a volume 3, and there are also going to be supplements for it. So one of the next books that comes out is going to be a text supplement. So it'll be a collection of a few little grimoires which focus on a particular subject. So all the material on that subject is together in like a supplement for it. But like I said, for me, I consider this being my life's work. There's going to be more and more to it in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
So I need to
volumes aren't the end of it.
Yeah, I need to dedicate a bookshelf to this then, essentially.
Yeah, this is not the end. This is just the beginning.
Excellent. And where can our audience find you if they're interested in seeing anything else that you're getting up to? Or
well, I'm not the best person with social media, I've got to be honest, because my time is generally spent on, my when I'm not at work, it's spent on my family and my magic and my writing. So I don't have that much time for. I mean, I do go on Facebook. If people want to message me on Facebook, it's like I get so many friend requests, but if people don't actually message me as well and say, I tend to ignore them. Just a random thing from somebody I have 0 friends in common with, or even if I have 100 friends in common with, if somebody messages me and say, "Oh, I read such and such book and I really enjoyed it, and I have a question or something," which I do get sometimes, people, that person I'll add because they want to engage. There is my website, davidrankin.com, which really needs an update. I've got to add stuff to it. At some point, hopefully this year, I was going to put like an archive of various articles and things I'd done, like some that have gone into anthologies and things, so they were available for people who might not have access to what were like limited edition anthologies and stuff like that, and make more material available there. So yeah, that's probably the best way to get hold of me, is message me on Facebook, because again, I have an Instagram account, but I virtually never use the thing. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm still slightly a slight dinosaur when it comes to these things. So, very to my wife, it's bringing me into the 21st century that I'm getting there eventually.
I'll just say to the audience, please don't swamp David with private messages on Facebook. Leave him be for a little bit. He needs to relax for a while. Yeah. Okay. Well, David, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Matt.
That was David Rankin, author of the Grimoire Encyclopaedia, which will be available from Hadean Press in the very near future. I am extremely excited to finally get my copy. I think it's going to completely change the entire field of both study and practice. Honestly, I was a little starstruck with this interview. David has been such an important figure in my personal exploration of this fascinating subject, so having the chance to discuss the grimoires with him was a real honor. I'm looking forward to seeing him on the show again in the future, and I really hope that you all enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please make sure that you like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in the future. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.